So in this lecture I wanted to talk about economic considerations of Bitcoin and blockchain. So we're going to deal with Bitcoin and blockchain directly, not just more general issues associated with big data and financial technology. So this part of the course will be more discursive and less quantitative in nature. Necessarily, therefore, it will be less practical and less computer based. I still think it's important though that you've had some exposure to computer programming and detailed computer programming issues in earlier parts of the course, although here on in we've got a slightly different way of thinking. Okay, so more discursive, and I think it's also important to bear in mind that these problems are always interdisciplinary in nature, and so that more than one perspective is always needed. It says here that we're going to talk about economic considerations of Bitcoin and blockchain. Now, within that, one thing that we will see is that past history of economic and financial systems is very important and a useful guide as to what to expect to happen in the future. Okay, so it's necessarily quite a wide-ranging topic, and multiple perspectives are needed in order to comprehend everything as fully as possible. So the aim of the lecture then is to introduce two completely new topics, and these topics really are jolly new, and indeed this is quite a rarity here to be teaching something that's so close to live academic research, and indeed so close to some of my own past academic research. Talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So there were two topics here, both jolly new. The first topic we're going to talk about today is blockchain, and then the second topic I wanted to introduce is discussion of some of the economics and finance of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. This does also link to blockchain, as Bitcoin is simply the first major application of blockchain technology, but blockchain is potentially much more general than that. Okay, and certainly with this, with the second issue, this is already a very important topic of academic research, even though, like the first topic, it is genuinely very, very new. Now, one thing I ought to say here is that I've tried to emphasize in this second point economic and financial aspects. Well, whilst that's true, one thing that I think is extremely important here is a historical perspective. Okay, so the historical perspective is always very important in these financial and economic systems. Often it's the only perspective that won't date, and it's important to think about different ways of thinking about problems. So the first thing to say is that the area is a very hot topic of academic research. So I've got some relevant research experience to share with you here. So I had a paper published in 2015, which it says there has got over 500 citations. It's now over 700 citations. Was awarded a International Best Paper Prize for a paper published the year after in 2016. So this was in some ways the highlight of my academic career, although learned an important lesson here that the subject does move very, very quickly, and you can easily be caught out by just how quickly the subject moves. I had a paper published a couple of years after that, an economic model where what you see is that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are interesting financially due to the high risk of catastrophic crashes, precisely because there is no central government authority behind it, no equivalent of the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve, for example. Then had a paper listed there, but formally published last year, an early paper just showing that interest in blockchain extends beyond Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and indeed you can think of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as just being the first major application of blockchain technology that everybody has heard of. Okay, blockchain potentially much more general than that. First topic I wanted to talk about today is the economics and finance of blockchain. Now, whilst this is true and it is going to be delivered as sort of advertised, one thing that I think this title misses is that a historical perspective is very, very important here. So often a historical perspective is the only perspective that won't date, and the more I think about the area, the more I'm convinced that's the case. You can learn an awful lot studying past history of these economics and financial systems, and things are usually less different than people would first have you believe. Okay, now what I wanted to try and do in this set of lectures is introduce you to new ways of thinking. So we're going to be talking about economic and financial issues, although we're going to do so in a more discursive and less quantitative way. Okay, but again, I just wanted to try and emphasize here that it is important to have as broad a perspective as possible. Okay, and within that, one of the things that you might actually learn the most from is studying various things that have happened before historically. Okay, contemporary economics and finance is obviously important, but within that, I think the historical perspective is easy to underestimate just how important this is. So, introducing blockchain then. So, blockchain is a foundational new technology and a new way of using cryptography to communicate in a decentralized way on complex networks. So, what this means essentially is that when you see the complex bit, there's lots and lots of things going on and lots of interaction between the microscopic parts of the system. And the decentralized bit just means that there's no equivalent of something like the Bank of England that governs everything. Okay, so the basic idea is that if you have this decentralized nature, there should be no central point of weakness and verification. So there's no equivalent of the Bank of England. So there's no way that you can sort of systematically attack, for instance, the central hub like the Bank of England and gain control of the network. So the Bank of England prints banknotes, but economically speaking, if you've got a central hub like this, you can view it as a potential source of weakness. And the idea is that if you have it instead a decentralized network, you don't have an obvious point of attack like that, so hopefully no central point of weakness. So the idea is that if you have, in contrast to the classical model of the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve, where you've got a large authority at the centre of the network, instead if you have a decentralized network, perhaps it's less easy to attack that because there's no obvious central weak point. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize here is that Bitcoin is just the first application of blockchain technology that everybody has heard of. But blockchain is potentially much more general than that. The basic idea in either case is to facilitate communication across a decentralized network. And then the aim of Bitcoin, which is the first application of this blockchain technology, is to use blockchain to communicate and verify what is known as a digital mining process. So in terms of the underlying economics, the basic aim is to try and tie the value of a digital currency to a scarce resource in a similar way to which national currencies were historically linked to the mining of precious metals. So there's all sorts of things that can sort of serve as a scarce resource on a currency here. So seashells in some distant historical cultures. Okay, but the point is that these things have a perceived worth and there is a cost to obtaining them. And here that cost comes about via this digital mining processes in close analogy to the mining of precious metals in historic societies. So the idea is that if you have no central hub and everything is decentralized, there's no central point of weakness and indeed no central point of corruption. So there's no way in which somebody like the Bank of England can progressively devalue the currency. So blockchain then is what's known as a decentralized transaction ledger. We'll discuss what this means in more detail in a couple of lectures' time. So the basic idea then is this is just a sort of decentralized network where nodes communicate in some sense. So each party on the blockchain has access to the entire database and its complete history. And the idea is that communication and verification occurs directly between users rather than via a central node or intermediary. So e.g. the government or the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve or an exchange in this instance. So the aim is to provide a consensus mechanism termed absolute law in this paper here by Jun. However, this absolute law is really a sort of intellectual utopia, and it's likely that some fundamental level of trust is likely to remain in order to form a majority consensus on networks, and indeed to have a payment system, for instance, that actually functions. Okay, but the basic idea is that you try and do away with a central node like the government or the Bank of England, and you just have communication and verification occurring directly between users. The idea is if you've got no central node, you've got no central point of weakness. Chain is a foundational new technology, but various aspects of it are quite familiar to what has gone on before, which is why I was trying to say earlier that whenever you're looking at something like this, a historical perspective is always important, and is possibly also one of the most important perspectives that's easiest to overlook. So there are important similarities with blockchain and existing electronic and payment systems. So, for instance, you can view cryptocurrencies, at least in part, as an extension of other forms of electronic payment like PayPal, and this is absolutely contemporary. So as I'm recording these lectures, one thing that has recently become more and more important during the pandemic is forms of electronic payment. And then for the second point, this is one of the important points I think of studying the nuts and bolts of computer packages like R. Notice how I'm more polite about freeware like R than Microsoft Excel, for instance. So this communication and verification on the network occurring directly between many individual users may share similarities between how open software may contain fewer bugs and be easy to use than, say, some Microsoft packages which were developed in a different way without this. In terms of blockchain systems then, so every transaction and its associated value are available to anyone with access to the system. And one thing to note here is that when it says value, really that probably means information. So once transactions are entered onto the blockchain and accounts are updated, records are chained to previous blocks of transactions and cannot be altered. So this is the reason for the term blockchain, because essentially what you've got is blocks of transactions or records essentially chained together. Okay, that's why you've got these two words bolted together to form the name blockchain. So once you do this, essentially what you have is a big database that's variously been described as permanent, chronologically ordered, and universally available to all users on the network. So the idea is that you've got a database that is sort of there for scrutiny and is about as close to being correct as is humanly possible to be. Now, one thing that is important to stress here is there may ultimately be a trade-off between consensus and processing time. So inevitably a trade-off between how right you want to be and how long you want to spend making sure that you are right. Okay, so blockchain, like anything else, likely to contain some imperfections. So the original motivation behind cryptocurrency blockchain was that there was concern raised at the progressive devaluation of national currencies. So this is potentially an issue if you've got a authority with disproportionate influence like the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve. Another aspect of this is problems occur if the monetization process moves too far away from something which enforces a degree of scarcity. So the classical example would be the use of precious metals as a store of value, as was the case with historic currencies, use of rare seashells, jewelry, etc. in other cultures historically. So what is happening with Bitcoin is the first major application of blockchain technology is that Bitcoin attempts to introduce a digital mining process to mimic the way in which national currencies were historically and relatively transparently linked to precious metals. Okay, so if you've got something that's got worth that backs up your currency, that's grounded in a lot of hard work fundamentally. Okay, and these digital mining processes as we discussed before, were enforced by an early application of blockchain technology. So Bitcoin is the first element of blockchain in widespread application, but blockchain technology is potentially much more general than Bitcoin.